I look out and see lots of familiar faces. And I know many of you have had long relationships with Jim and are here filled with memories. For me, Jim was a teacher, a colleague, and a friend. And in all my years of academic life, I've never known any teacher who had as great an impact on students as Jim did. We've already identified a few of his former students, and I'm just curious, if you were a former student of Jim's, raise your hand. Wow, even more than I might have guessed. And I think we will all be forever grateful. For me, I first encountered Jim in my junior year here at the University of Texas as an undergraduate, when I took his 347K, Government and Politics of South Asia, 1958-59. Jim launched many of us onto careers in the Foreign Service, public service, in academic life. Coincidentally, I ended up, after graduate school and teaching at Oberlin College for a brief period, back here at UT as a colleague of Jim's. See, David Kendrick. David and I were undergraduates together, and Jim had a deep impact on each of us and launched us on our academic careers. And like me, coincidentally, David came back and is now a professor of economics at the University of Texas. Well, I went on to become an India specialist from that first course I took with Jim back in 1958. But Jim himself had not found India by such a direct route. For him, it was almost by accident. Jim had gotten his PhD at Harvard and did his dissertation on Australian foreign policy. And after he came to UT and began teaching, he took a Fulbright to Australia, 1951-52. And again at that time, he looked at Australian foreign policy. And on his return to Austin, the chairman of the department at that time said, "Roach, you've been in Australia, you've been looking at Australian foreign policy. That surely includes much of Asia. We don't offer a course on Asia at the University of Texas, and I'd like you to develop it." Well, he did. It was a course on South and Southeast Asia, and I was the beneficiary of that course, as were many other people. But Jim went off to India soon after he had started teaching that course. In 1951-52, he went to India for the first time as a Ford Foundation research scholar. And he was based in Delhi. His project was financial federalism in India, the relationship between the central government and its many states. And one day, in the course of his stay in Delhi, he went to a play. I think it was a George Bernard Shaw play, sponsored by the British consul. And he took his seat, and he noticed as the curtain was beginning to come down, someone hurrying up and taking a seat right beside him. Well, at the intermission, they introduced themselves to each other, and the gentleman sitting next to Jim said, "Hello, my name is Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm the Prime Minister of India." And he asked Jim what he was doing. And Jim told him a little bit about the project, financial federalism. And Nehru said, "Well, when you find the answer, come back and tell me." Well, Jim went back to India 5 years later, again coincidental with the Indian elections. This would have been 1961-62. Actually, it was, I guess, 10 years later. And this time it was on a Fulbright to the University of Rajasthan. And on his return, having had a Fulbright, he was drawn into the Fulbright program nationally and invited to join the Board of Foreign Scholarships, which was the apex organization for governmentally sponsored scholarships for study overseas, of which the Fulbright program was the premier institution. And in the course of that service, indeed, Jim chaired the organization for several years. In the early 1970s, after the Bangladesh War in 1971, U.S.-Indian relations were not very good. You may recall that we had tilted toward Pakistan. And India decided to take out its unhappiness by restricting visas to American scholars, students, and professors. And of course, this hit Fulbright right in the face. And Jim was, at that time, overseeing the Fulbright program worldwide, but with particular responsibility for South and Southeast Asia. And he got together a group of people from the Board of Foreign Scholars. And they went off to India to try to work with ministers and with various officials to try to work through this problem and open access so that American scholars could again return to India for study. He was very effective, not wholly successful, but he did an amazing job in again opening India. And the ambassador at that time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was very impressed by Jim. And in 1974, the cultural attaché, the counselor for cultural affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Delhi, resigned suddenly. And Moynihan said, "Get Roach." And therein entered one of the most important periods in Jim's life. He accepted the appointment to become cultural attaché, counselor at the embassy, on a 2-year appointment. His job was to represent America to the world. And India at that time had the largest program in cultural affairs of any embassy anywhere. From the embassy, we operated 4 libraries in cultural centers based not only in Delhi, but Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Large libraries with extensive cultural programs, visiting lectures, all kinds of things going on. It was a big operation, and Jim loved it. Some of you, I think, may have had the opportunity to visit him during those years that he was there. Well, not only did he love it, he was very, very good. And the ambassador wanted him to stay on for yet another year. Well, UT, 2 years leave, okay. A 3rd year was problematic, but yes, they agreed to it. So Jim stayed on. And at the end of that 3rd year, the ambassador was absolutely insistent that Jim remain. He had done such a good job and such a critical posting. This time, the University of Texas found it a little too difficult, maybe just to say, okay, a fourth year's leave was unprecedented. And it took Lady Bird Johnson's personal intervention with the Board of Regents for us to say, okay, Jim, stay on. Well, Jim did return and continued to teach and to enrich our lives as a teacher, as a colleague, and as a friend. And I shall be forever grateful to him. There are a lot of us who would be very grateful to Jim, and one of them is right here in the middle of this photograph. It includes Bill Livingston, Jim, Carl Schmidt on the far right, and then I'm next to Carl. And standing here is Richard Kramer. Many of you know Richard. Richard had retired from the Air Force as a colonel in the mid-1960s and entered the program of the Department of Government to work on his PhD. And Jim Roach supervised his dissertation. Well, Richard would have been with us tonight, but he's having some health problems. At 90, he's still very vigorous and active, but beginning to slow down a bit. He sends his regrets in not being here. But he also sends a story that he asked me to relate. Carl mentioned what I think all of us know well, and that is that Jim Roach was a very private person. And he would be the last to toot his own horn. So I guess maybe it's for us to toot it for him. Well, one of these toots, I think, comes out of World War II. And again, Carl Schmidt mentioned Jim's service in the U.S. Navy. Well, Richard asked me to convey a story that had been related to him 25 or 30 years ago and had stuck in his mind all these years. We had a colleague, some of you may remember, Murray Havens. Murray was in the Department of Government and some 25 or 30 years ago went off to Australia on a Fulbright. And there he met a man who had known Jim Roach during the Second World War. And that man described to Richard something that Richard had never known, and that is what Jim did as a naval officer in the Second World War, defusing bombs. And this man said, speaking to Murray Havens, Jim Roach was the bravest man I ever met. Jim was a very private man. But I suspect that each one of us knows some facet of Jim Roach that is totally unknown to anybody else. And it's in a memorial like this that I think we can come together and share these memories